This is Join Us in France, episode 444, 444. Bonjour, I'm Annie Sargent, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we talk about France, everyday life in France, great places to visit in France, French culture, history, gastronomy, and news related to travel to France. Today, I bring you a trip report with Phil Roberson about visiting Normandy during a D-Day anniversary celebration. Whether you're a history buff, a Francophile, or simply a traveler seeking profound experiences, this episode will leave you with a deeper understanding of World War II events that shaped our world. So sit back, relax, and let's set off on this commemorative journey together to honor the past and embrace the resilience of the human spirit. Here we go, en route to Normandy with Phil Roberson, who's been to Normandy many times. For the magazine part of the podcast, today I'll give you a brief report on the boot camp, which just ended and was great fun. But my conversation with Phil ran long, so you'll hear all about the boot camp in episode 445 next week. Then you'll also hear about many boot camp participants. I went to Fond de Gomme last Sunday thanks to Jim, who had 2 tickets he couldn't use, and he mentioned that on the Facebook group for the podcast. And I said, "Ooh, I'd love to go." I'll send out a newsletter about that because it's not so easy to get tickets to Fond de Gomme unless you understand how they operate. And now, having talked to the lady who does all the website stuff, I think I do. I'll send out a newsletter that lays it all out. And if you don't already get the newsletter, go to joinusinfrance.com/newsletter. If you barely just signed up for it and haven't received anything yet, don't worry. It's just that I don't send out so many. I'm permanently trying to get better about that, but there's just one of me. This podcast is supported by donors and listeners who buy my tours and services, including my itinerary consult service and my GPS self-guided tours of Paris on the Voice Map app. And you can purchase any of those things at my boutique, joinusinfrance.com/boutique. And if you just want to read details about the tours and read the reviews, go to joinusinfrance.com/Annie Tours. And that will take you to the Voice Map page where you can read all of the reviews. But of course, you only get the discount if you buy from my boutique. So, I know it's a little complicated, but that's how it's set up. I would like to play some feedback on the itinerary consult from Anne Spittler. Thank you so much, Anne. And if you did an itinerary with me, please record a voice memo with your thoughts and email it to me at annie@joinusinfrance.com, and I will play it on the podcast. And thank you very much.
Bonjour, Annie. This is Anne from Northern California. Thank you so much for the itinerary that you created for me. I'm quite excited about my solo trip, my first trip to France. Thank you so much for all of the attention and detail that you provide in these itineraries. And even though I might not be able to enjoy all of the sites or all of the things that you mention, I just enjoy reading it and then, of course, mentally planning my next several trips. So thank you so much. Merci. And I look forward to keeping up with your podcast.
Bonjour, Phil, and welcome to Join Us in France.
Bonjour, Annie. Glad to be back.
Oh, lovely to have you back. I think of you as Mr. Normandy because you visited Normandy 9 times, you said?
I believe so, yeah.
Including 7 times during the anniversary celebrations. And I've been very lucky to have you on the podcast 3 times already to talk about your experiences. That was episodes 116 and 176. They were trip reports. Plus episode 201, where you related all the things that you've learned about Operation Overlord and the Battle of Normandy, because you're an amateur historian. So that was a really interesting episode as well. And I recommend all 3 for folks who are looking into a visit of Normandy. Today, the first topic we're going to tackle is visiting D-Day sites when anniversary celebrations are underway. Then we'll also talk about driving a car out of Paris to go to Normandy, which is something a lot of people worry about. We'll mention some of the wonderful towns where you stop along the way between Paris and Normandy. And if there's time, we'll talk about some other stuff, taking the train back to Paris and some of the American monuments in Paris that don't get mentioned often enough. So now it really gets busy in Normandy around June 6th every year, doesn't it, Phil?
Yes, it does. I mean, it just gets so many more people arriving, including, some veterans, although fewer and fewer every year, dignitaries, etc. And I will say it's always busy around the anniversary of D-Day, but particularly anniversaries ending in a year 0 or 5. So I was there for the 70th and the 75th anniversary, and I plan on being back for the 80th. But that really tends to bring out a lot more people, a lot more events. And as I mentioned, even dignitaries that can close roads off and things like that when heads of state visit.
Yeah. And, I don't know if people realize, but Normandy is a very rural area. It's a very large area geographically. And so sometimes it feels like there's a lot of empty between these towns. And obviously there aren't, like in Paris, you have hotels every other block, perhaps more. But in Normandy, it's not like that. The facilities for visitors are limited. And that's why it gets really, really booked up. Tell us about that a little bit. How far ahead do you have to book your hotel, for instance?
Well, as far as you can, once you know you're going. The problem is a lot of places don't want to take a reservation more than a year out. And then they quickly book up once they open up their reservation. But as you mentioned, there are very few places. There are very few hotels. There's some bed and breakfasts, some gîtes you can rent. But a lot of the people that go there regularly book those places up ahead of time. And I'll tell you that I've already got my reservation for 2024. And I honestly wouldn't tell you the location if I hadn't already had it confirmed. Because when I called her last fall, she said, we're not booking until the beginning of 2024, but I can tell you I've already had more people express interest than we have space for. So at the beginning of this year, I just reached out one more time, even though I was a year early. And a month later, she said, yeah, okay, I'm going to confirm you. Just go ahead and, you can count on it. But I've had other problems. I rented a B&B that I thought was confirmed. And the owner told me it was confirmed one year. And then it changed hands. They sold it. And the new owner was not honoring either the rates or even the reservations. So I got in touch with the old owner and pleaded my case. And he arranged for me to stay in a bedroom in his mother's place in a nearby town.
Oh, goodness.
Which wasn't quite the historical town, but it was very nice of him and her.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of difficulty you can run into.
Right. I guess one way to get around this is to drive yourself to a bigger city and just get up early and try and make your way to the sites. But then there's the problem that the roads might be closed.
Well, sometimes that really has only happened to me a couple times, and that was on June 6th itself, and usually due to heads of state and security, etc. But one thing to keep in mind, when people talk about D-Day and the Normandy battle in a broader context, is it's a huge area. So there's a lot of space, a lot of different places to go to pay tribute to that anniversary. And it's not like everyone just, sits on the shore of Omaha Beach. There are events, there are celebrations, there are commemorations all over. And the beaches themselves are about 60 miles apart as the crow flies. And there's not a direct road between the two or between the 5. So you have to go inland to get from place to place. And just driving between places, all of a sudden you'll see a monument in some obscure location on the side of the road. And, if you see it, jump out and take a look and you'll learn something.
Right.
So it's not like you're really limited to one town center or anything like that. And there are a lot of different towns that it's possible to stay in that make it easy to reach a lot of areas.
Right. Because the big cities are Rouen, but it's a little far from the D-Day sites.
That's quite far, yes.
Then you have Caen,
which is probably the biggest right near the beaches. And even that's not right on the beaches, but it's the biggest city. I personally don't find it appealing because it was mostly destroyed and it's very industrial now. But that is certainly the biggest place. And if all the other locations were locked out, that would be a place to look.
Yes. Then you have Le Havre, but that's also not so close.
Yep, that's quite a ways.
And then you have Cherbourg, but that's the wrong end as well. You have Bayeux, of course, which is a, mid-sized city.
And Bayou's probably the most desirable place for people to stay. And it does have a few hotels and a few B&Bs, which is more than most of the littler towns have. It's very central, and it's particularly central to both American and British beaches. It's sizable enough that there are a lot of places to eat, a few places to stay, and has some other sites right within the town itself. In addition to their wonderful D-Day museum, there's also the Bayeux Tapestry and a British burial ground that's probably the largest in the area.
Right. So expect when you go at that time of year, which I did just once, but you can expect to see a lot of classic Jeeps.
Yeah.
A lot of people dressed up in various uniforms and fatigues and things like that. Tell us about what you see around. Describe the setting.
Yeah, you will see a lot of vehicles. My understanding is that when World War II ended, this huge buildup by the Allies of men and equipment wasn't felt like it was needed. And rather than shipping all these trucks and Jeeps back to the U.S., they basically left them there. So things that might be very hard to find in the U.S. seem, at least during a D-Day anniversary, seem commonplace. And you may pull out on a road and see a Jeep coming and not realize that there's 15 behind it and they're doing a little parade from beach to beach or something like that. And so the people that restore these, some of them are reenactors to varying degrees. So that's a big part of their commemoration, is celebrating with their friend with similar vehicles. And there's even a couple places in Saint-Mère-Église and near Omaha Beach where they have encampments for the whole week. And all these people's reenactors and vehicles will basically set up camp there. And the camps are open for anyone to walk into, and they have historic style tents and all sorts of equipment that you wouldn't even think of, like a spotlight that's carried on a trailer behind a truck that they use to search for enemy aircraft, camp kitchens, all sorts of really interesting things. And you'll see that in a few towns. And, just in traffic, there'll be a Willys Jeep from World War II that somebody restored. When I went this past year, my host, there was a couple that hosted this B&B. He had a Jeep, a restored Jeep in his back garage that he proudly showed me on the first day. And then a gentleman from somewhere in Brittany, an older gentleman, came up to stay there, and he brought his Jeep, and he actually took me out for a ride in it. It was pouring rain. It was open top, but took me out on a ride and brought me to this place where this encampment where there were not only other Jeeps, but tanks and all sorts of vehicles. And you'll see people wearing, accurate World War II uniforms. You'll also see somebody, wearing just like a camo scarf, around his neck in a very French way, but, peeing against a tree or whatever. So it's not all perfectly, accurate regiments of people.
Yeah. And there's also a lot of motorcycles with sidecars, airplanes. You can tell us about the airplanes, right?
There are a lot of airplanes during the anniversary, and a lot of them are current military aircraft because along with the reenactors, you have current U.S., French, and even German military that show up for the anniversary. And there's a huge parachute jump on the Saturday nearest to June 6th. It's gigantic. So all these planes are in town for this, and it's some sort of a training regiment for the military. So they use this to bring in all sorts of, military personnel that inhabit the towns. But while they're there, these huge troop transport planes just seem to be buzzing towns randomly, just for fun. And you'll also see, I forget the name of the French acrobatic military.
La Patrouille de France.
Yes. You'll see them occasionally. You've seen them just practicing offshore and trailing smoke. And then, you may be on Omaha Beach and a bunch of huge transport helicopters come overhead just because they're there and they're in practice and training.
It's quite the atmosphere. It's really very fun. I can see why you keep going back. Because when life gives you lemon, make lemonades. It seems like French people in this part of the world have been able to, some terrible things happened, but they're turning it into lemonade, I guess.
Yeah, they celebrate the liberation. And I think I mentioned this to you before that, in the U.S. and I believe the U.K., we refer to it as a D-Day invasion. But the local Normans don't see it that way at all. They're like, we weren't invaded, we were liberated. The invasion came from Nazi Germany years before. So they really celebrate it because that was the start of their freedom as a country and certainly of that area. But yeah, there was awful battle and there's awful atrocities. And there's a lot of French that died by the Allied hands because when we'd go in to liberate a city, the first thing that we do is shell it with artillery. And so there's a lot of civilian casualties, but they recognize that. But overall, they're looking at the outcome that started with D-Day.
So let's talk for a second about how do you prepare for a trip like this? Imagine that somebody is listening to you and green with envy. They want to do the same thing you did. They want to go. How would you go about if this was your friend who was trying to do this? What would you say other than come with me, I'll show you all the ropes?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing you need to do is to learn as much history as you can. And I sometimes get into debates with people, not debates, but a lot of people will go there and say, I just want to have a tour. I just want to have somebody show me everything. And that's fine. I'm not the type of person that gravitates towards tours, but that's good. But you're going to learn so much more with a tour or without a tour if you already know the basics of what happened. So I would say the first thing to do is get an overview of it, whether that's a book or a couple movies or something like that. Know what happened and look at a map. I think too many times people that haven't been there or don't know just think of Omaha Beach or the American Cemetery. And those are must-sees, in my opinion. But there's so much more. So look at all the towns that you mentioned and, the 5 beaches from Utah Beach to Gold Beach, and understand where people came ashore, where people parachuted in, and where the overall battles were. Yep. And that will give you an idea when you're going from town to town, what happened. If you're going from Utah Beach to St. Mary Glees, you'll realize that that's the area that those two groups had to connect in this area, or it wouldn't be a successful battle from the Allies' perspective.
And it also explains why there are so many monuments everywhere, because it was everywhere, really.
It really was. And the other thing, too, is when we talk about the Battle of Normandy, it's more than just D-Day. That was really considered, Operation Overlord was the mission to take Normandy back. And it really included everything from D-Day up until the recapture of Paris in September. So, if you really want to dig deeper than just D-Day, which I advise people do it, they got off the beaches relatively quick. And then there was all sorts of things that happened inland. And they'd have to set up temporary airfields and all sorts of towns to the south of the beaches. They'd have to liberate one at a time. So understand the big picture of that. Mm-hmm. And I think listening to one of your earlier podcasts would do a good job of that in an hour podcast. But, invest in a decent book, and I could make several recommendations, or, a good overview movie, not just something like Band of Brothers, because that's just one unit in one area, but, get the big picture of the battle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then the next thing I'd say, once you have a big picture and in general where you want to stay, secure a reservation as soon as possible. Mm-hmm. Don't wait. Don't put it off. Don't go, I'll look at it next month or whatever. Keep trying. You may have to call places if they're smaller and their online reservation system may not be open. But if you speak to them, they may be able to secure you a room or a hotel or something like that. So I would say do that before the airfare, because the airfare, there's tons of flights going to France all the time. And you can find it.
You can't emphasize that enough. Just call these places and don't look for the perfect little place that has the perfect feel, whatever. Just call the places and offer, and they speak English, a lot of these mm-hmm. hotel places and B&Bs and whatever, and offer to pay the rooms in full today. Like,
Yep.
I'm coming. Because they have to manage so many reservations, cancellations, people who want their money back, blah, blah, blah. People want to add a room. It gets really complicated. So just say, look, I'm going to give you the money today, but save me a room between this date and this date. You paid in full right away.
Yeah, they're worried that they'll hold the room with no payment on the prime week of the year, and then you don't show up or you cancel a week beforehand. So you have to look at it a little bit from their perspective. And even when I have a reservation, every few months, I just send an email and go, just confirming, not so much for Paris or for places en route, but for anywhere in Normandy. Because like I said, I did have a place that I thought was secured and fell apart. And that was very stressful at the time.
Yeah. And French people work a lot on having had a personal relationship with people. It's aggravating because if they don't know you, the first thing is going to be, oh, no, we're full. No, we can't. But then you have to negotiate. You say, I'm coming and I'm really interested in this, that. You have to talk, you have to tell them about you, and so that they get a feeling that you're a real person and you mean this. And you're not going to be a flake, because they get a lot of flake.
Think to yourself, what can I say to make this person comfortable? And I think you had mentioned, or somebody in previous podcast episodes had mentioned, that their first inclination is to say no.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But you can't just say, okay, they said no, it's over. That's just when you started your negotiation.
Yeah, this is where you start talking. Just expect that they're going to say no, and then think about the things that you can, the arguments you can make to get to yes. You have to be a negotiator.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And that helps in a lot of situations in France. Don't take no for an answer. Otherwise, game over.
Yeah.
All right. What's the situation like for restaurants, and how about figuring out where the celebrations are? Do you just go to the tourist office and ask them? What do you do?
I usually go in the west of the D-Day beach area was Utah Beach, and inland from there is St. Mary Église. And I tend to go there for a couple reasons. One is it was the center of the U.S. airborne operations. But because of that, that's where the U.S. military basically hangs out for the week. The current U.S. military hangs out for the week. So that really is the center of a lot of those activities. And they have a wonderful tourist office. I think that St. Mary Église shares with Carentan, which is another town inland from there. And they list a lot of the events. Here, again, you get to the point where they probably don't have all the events listed for this year, much less next year. I'm sure they don't have anything listed for next year. But they will show up, and I would just keep checking back and put those events in your calendar. There's a lot of little events at memorials, for this particular unit or that particular unit. I went to a wonderful one when I first arrived at my B&B last year. I was fortunate because the couple that hosts my B&B, he's a detective in Caen, and she works in the town hall in St. Mary Église. So they knew all the events that were happening, and I, of course, had a lot in my calendar. But he took me to this one event that was dedicating a new monument to a priest that actually jumped in, Father Maternowski, and he jumped in with the 82nd Airborne, and he was the first chaplain who died on D-Day, or the only chaplain that died on D-Day itself. So they set up a monument for him, and that sort of thing is usually attended by local French organizations, local French officials or politicians, and U.S. military. So there was a U.S. military color guard there, and very often speeches are made in both French and English. Both the U.S. and French national anthems are played, which is always a little embarrassing to me because the Americans just don't sing along. They just don't do it. So they usually start with the American national anthem. You get a few low voices, and it's very quiet. And then the French national anthem comes on. The whole French town starts singing along full-throated.
Well, the French national anthem is easier to sing than the Star-Spangled Banner.
I think you're right, but I think it's also a cultural thing.
It might. Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, I join in. Yeah, I do.
I think if you ask the average American citizen when they hear the national anthem, do they sing along? The answer would be no. And the answer would be the opposite for your average French citizen.
Yeah.
But at any rate, so they'll have all sorts of things like that going on at these ceremonies. And I was fortunate when my host brought me to this ceremony. It was hosted by an organization, I'm looking for the name of it. It was something like Association US Normandy Memoire et Gratitude. So, memory and gratitude. And afterwards, they had a little gathering in a local hall. It was, the French equivalent of a U.S. Knights of Columbus Hall or something like that. And they had some speeches. And this was all French people. And I really felt honored to be in there because this was just the local French people. And they had a little toast with cider that they served in these champagne flutes. And it was very touching to see their gratitude and to participate in their local ceremony as opposed to just the big roadside thing with the U.S. military there. But that's the type of thing you have to, look for. And if you see an opportunity, just jump on it, or even just follow a crowd that's going towards a particular monument. But in a more direct answer to your question, yeah, they will eventually publish a very detailed list of events starting in late May and going all the way to mid-late June. And, put them in your calendar, put them in a map and go. And even if it's something you're not that familiar with, I find them very moving. And I will add that there doesn't seem to be as many activities around Omaha Beach as there are at St. Mary Glace, which is a little strange in my mind. But again, I think it's just because that's where the current U.S. military tends to congregate. But I know there are events over on the East End by Pegasus Bridge by the British. And of course, there's the annual ceremony at the U.S. American Normandy Cemetery on June 6th itself. Mm-hmm. And that is a invitation-only event, but it hasn't been hard for me to get an invitation. You simply go onto the U.S. Battle Monuments website and submit an application. When I was there for the 75th anniversary, and keep in mind that they had President Macron and President Trump there, while I was in Normandy, I got an email from them saying, you've been invited to join this thing. So I went out and, for those, or at least on the anniversary, the big anniversaries, you can't park anywhere close. You have to park in a remote town and they bus you in. But this last year when I went, there were no heads of state there. There was very long security lines, but you could pull right into the parking lot at that cemetery. They have speeches, they have some veterans, they have flybys, etc.
So on June 6th, you could perhaps plan to do one or two things, but can't zoom around to all these different places, right?
Well, and again, it depends whether it's a 5 or 10 year anniversary as well. Last year, I drove right to the Normandy Cemetery and then I could drive and see other things afterwards. Oh. But the 2 times I went on the 70th and 75th, the main highway was closed and a lot of the roads right near the beaches were closed. And if you were a local citizen, you could get a parking permit ahead of time or a driving permit ahead of time, but you couldn't just as a tourist take your rental car down. And I remember one year, the Queen of, am I getting this right? Queen of Denmark or Paris? I don't even know if they have a queen.
I think they do, yeah.
Who was there for a ceremony. So Utah Beach was closed for that day, just while she was there. But those again, tend to be the 5 and 10 year anniversaries, and they do publish it. You just don't want to be caught unaware. When I left the 75th anniversary at the Normandy American Cemetery, even though I had to be bused back to a town several towns away, I still couldn't take the highway home to my B&B. I had to take back roads, which I fortunately know, but
yeah, you have to be patient. There's going to be a lot of people and there's going to be security everywhere. So you got to be patient and, roll with it kind of deal. I think another good website for information is Normandy Tourisme. So if you do en.normandy-tourisme.fr, they have a very good site in English, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And of course, they don't publicize stuff lots and lots of time ahead, okay? Because they have so many events going on that they just do a month and a half ahead.
Yeah, because they may not know. It's not just that they don't publish it. They don't really know yet. The Association of Normandy Gratitude, they don't have their calendar ready yet. So the tourism board doesn't. But if you know you're going to be there from like June 2nd to June 8th or something like that, just start filling in place on your calendar as these events come up. I will tell you another thing that I've done that they publish at the tourism office, which I thought was wonderful, is they do these walking tours of the paratrooper landing areas. And usually they break into groups. So they'll have a French language tour and an English language tour. And I had a hard time getting, those seemed to sell out right away. But it was very interesting to walk in these little Normandy villages where people landed and fought their way out at night and hear stories of that. So if you can walk a few miles, I highly recommend that.
Yeah. Or a bike or a scooter or I don't know.
But again, if you know the history or some basic history and you've got a car, even when there's things closed off or there's a big crowd somewhere, there's always somewhere to go. There's always some site, some little cemetery or some little battle area where no one else will be, or you'll be one of only a few people there.
Yes, and they do have at least the mayor and probably some local veterans or local military people who are going to attend these ceremonies. In our tiny village in the south of France, we always have people who show up for these ceremonies. Sometimes there's a band, sometimes it's a military band, sometimes there's more than one military band. People come out to these things and you don't have to have an invitation to the biggest event there. You can enjoy it over the whole area.
I remember one of the first ceremonies I went to at a monument on one of my earliest anniversary trips. So it was really touching because there were several different military units there and military bands. And there was a German military band, and they played the U.S. Star Spangled Banner, which I thought was pretty touching. But I think I found out because I just talked to either somebody in the tourist office or someone on the street. And they said, oh, you need to go see this XYZ event.
Yes, German soldiers and military is invited all the
Absolutely.
time. There is no animosity at this point. It's pointless to, we're not enemies. We're friends and we're allies and friends. And this is behind us and we want to keep it that way. All right. Wonderful. I assume restaurants are really, really full as well, but you can always grab a sandwich, right? Somewhere. I mean, you're not going to starve.
You're not going to starve, but if you want to sit down and have a meal in some of the smaller towns, there may only be a couple options. And if you just wait till you're hungry at 7:30 at night, you may be out of luck. So I actually try to make reservations. One of my favorite places in St. Mary-Église, I emailed a couple of years ago when I was planning on going, saying I wanted to make a reservation. And then my trip was canceled due to the pandemic. So I emailed them again. They said, oh, yeah, we remember you. Sure, we can have you in Thursday night or whatever. And it was just nice for me. I like having the peace of mind if I'm not going to have to go looking for a meal. But there certainly are places, and, worst case, there's boulangeries that sell little sandwiches and things like that. I tend to do lunches, like picnic lunches. I have my little cutting board, napkin, knife, and I go buy baguette and some fruit and cheese. And that's my go-to lunch. And even if it's just sitting on Omaha Beach watching planes fly overhead, that's fine by me.
Yeah, it's not bad at all. That's good. All right. Let's talk about driving in Normandy and also starting in Paris, because you started your trip in Paris and made your way to Normandy. What is that like? Where did you pick up your rental car? Tell us the whole process.
I've driven through Paris a couple times. Once or twice, I picked up my car upon landing at CDG and drove right from the airport. And the problem with that, well, there's a couple problems with that. One, you're apt to be extremely jet lagged. And, some would say it's almost criminal to even jump in a car and try to do that. But the other is when I arrive, at least from the East Coast of the US, my flight arrives at maybe 6 or 7 in the morning. And by the time you get through luggage and immigration and rental car, you're right smack dab in the middle of rush hour. Mm-hmm. So even though you're not driving right into downtown Paris per se, the periphery roads are completely blocked up. And once you get out of the periphery roads, it really opens up and it's good highways, smooth sailing. So that's one option. What I've done many times, I go to Paris, spend a day or two, and then take a train to Normandy and pick up a car there. But this time I decided to pick up a car in Paris. And I picked a Hertz office that was in the northwest corner of Paris. So it wasn't that far from the outskirts. And I drove to Normandy. And I will say that it was right about rush hour. And the one instruction I asked him, tell me what road gets me directly to the periphery. Because then I'm on highway and my GPS kicks in, I'll be fine. And he gave me the wrong road. So I just had to do like a clover leaf or two to circle back in the right direction. But again, once you get out of those outer ring roads around Paris, it's really good highways. I've never found them crowded. And I like it because I can stop and see sights en route. So I basically followed the Seine River downstream and stopped at a couple things I'd always wanted to see. And it just gave me the flexibility. Whereas if I had taken a train, I was going to spend that night in Rouen. If I'd taken a train directly to Rouen, that would have been easy, but I wouldn't have been able to see the other things on the way.
Right. Just one more detail about the rental, the Hertz place. This was not at a train station or airport. This was within a city.
It was in the city Port-Melot, Maillot.
Okay.
And it was up in the north. I'm trying to look at a map, but it's up in the northwest corner, just beyond the Arc de Triomphe, but before the periphery, before the big highway.
Okay. So you got there on public transportation and just picked up a car.
Yeah, I took a bus. I'm sure I took a bus there from my hotel. And again, I was pretty quickly out of the rush hour, out of the highways. And fortunately, most cars now have Apple CarPlay. So you just plug in your phone and if you have an Apple phone, and it's just like using it at home. You don't even have to change. You may have to change the language, but I think if it's your phone determines what language it gives it to you in. And I like that because I'll put in these locations in my calendar or in my Google Maps and I'll save them. So now I can just call it up and drive. I will say one time, it was a little humorous, and maybe this happens other places in the world, but I was navigating to the next location and it brings me down to a river where there's a ferry. And it basically says, cross the river. So I drove on the ferry and crossed over.
Wow.
I just never had that happen here before, but maybe that happens many places.
Yeah, interesting. All right. So the towns where you stopped, the first one was Giverny.
Actually, before that, I stopped at La Roche-Guyon.
Ah, La Roche-Guyon. Yes, La Roche-Guyon.
Yeah, which is an old castle, and I highly recommend that because I was, of course, first made aware of it because that was the headquarters for German Field Marshal Rommel when he was in charge of all the Atlantic wall defenses. So that's how I heard about it. But they really minimized that part of its history. It's a very old medieval chateau way up. There's a lower chateau, and then there's a castle keep way up on the hill. And it gives you wonderful views of the Seine. I was there on a beautiful blue sky day. It's quite a bit of walking and stairs to get to the top, but it's an unbeatable view. And I just found it very, very interesting. They've got little museum exhibits throughout, and that was a must-see for me, and one reason that I knew I'd have to rent a car because I don't think you could take public transportation there. I doubt you could.
Probably not.
So I did go to Giverny, but I did not actually go to Monet's gardens. And a couple reasons. One is I didn't know exactly when I'd get there. I only knew I wanted to see some sights en route and end up in Rouen. So I didn't have pre-planned tickets. And when I started walking up there, the town itself and the path and road leading to the gardens is beautiful. And then there was a big line, and I just I'm not into big lines or crowds. If I could be there alone, I'm sure I'd love it, but it may not be the best place for Phil on your average day there.
Yeah, lots of people, yes.
Yeah, so I just had lunch in town, and I headed out and then went to Rouen after that. And when I drove, and this is a little unusual thing driving, my hotel was right in the old part of Rouen. And to get there, you had to actually drive through a pedestrian-only area. So I found myself in this pedestrian zone with a car thinking, I'm doing something wrong here. But they'd given me specific directions, and the entrance to their underground parking was in that pedestrian area. So I drove there. There were no barriers. And when I left the next morning, I did have to put in a code to lower a barrier to get out. But then you really don't need a car in that city itself. It just sat underground for the one night I was there.
Yeah, this happens a lot in city centers in France. I would say most French city centers have kind of bollards that come out of the ground to let residents through, but not anybody.
And delivery vehicles and things like that.
Exactly. Delivery people, taxis can lower the bollards usually. Very often Uber cannot. So if you're coming in and you know your hotel is right in the city center, it's better to take a taxi than an Uber because the Uber is going to just drop you at the line, city center line.
And if you are driving, I highly recommend getting very specific directions from your hotel of how to get there and what parking is or isn't available. They may not have their own parking, but they may know the best lot or best place on the street to park your car at least.
Right.
It's much better than just showing up going, okay, Google Maps tells me I'm near my hotel, but now I don't know what to do.
Yes. Usually the hotels that are in those situations, if you tell them you're driving to them, they will give you directions of how to do this. You just need to pay attention to the emails that they exchange. And you also went to the Abbaye de Jumièges, and I don't know about this. I would like to hear about.
Oh, yeah, that was fascinating. It's this huge ruin of I don't know how you'd actually describe it. It was a medieval castle. I think it was built in honor of William the Conqueror. It's a ruin right now, but you can tell it was gigantic. I think it was built in his honor, and he used it as his base of operations after he had invaded or conquered England and came back to Normandy. So it's this toppled over ruin that's several stories tall with all manicured grass around it. And it's just phenomenal just to walk in something that's that old. Mm. And, in the U.S., we just don't have things that old unless you get into, Native American cliff dwellings. And it's similar to that in some ways. You build things out of stone and they'll still be there 1,000 years from now. But again, beautiful day and beautiful just walking around the ruins. And I had lunch right across the street at a little cafe in town. So if you're on the road and you're going down the Seine, I highly recommend stopping in there.
Cool. And then you stopped at the Merville Battery. This is a place where I have not been either. I know about it, but I haven't been. So tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, this was a German gun installation that the British airborne had a particularly heroic assault on. I mean, it seemed impossible when you look at how well fortified this was with barbed wire and minefields, machine gun nests, and these guys jumping out of planes just have to, have a plan to how do you take it. But they did, at high cost, but they did eventually take it. And it was one of the early successes on the night of D-Day. So June 5th, June 6th. and it was by the British. They had a couple very impressive feats of heroism. One was that, and one was the Pegasus Bridge, which is not that far away, which was a bridge they had to capture to keep the Germans from bringing reinforcements in. And they basically literally crash landed their gliders at the base of the bridge and stormed out and took the bridge before the Germans could respond. So, I have a feeling if you grow up in England, you hear more about that than you hear about, the U.S. airborne, and likewise in the U.S. But I think it's interesting to see all aspects of the battle. And that really defined the eastern edge of the D-Day assault.
Right, yes. Yes, the Americans were more to the west. But I mean, all things considered, it's 100 kilometers between the two, more or less?
Yeah, that's about right. I mean, there were 5 beaches, and the western 2, Utah and Omaha, were the American ones. And so they had the airborne landing to the west of that to safeguard the flank. And then the 3rd one was British, the 4th was mostly Canadian, and the 5th was British. So the British landed to the east of that to guard their flank. And the whole idea is...
Those beaches are gone.
West to east is Utah, Omaha, Sword, Juneau, and Gold. Either that or it's Gold, Juneau, and Sword. But those are the 5s. And originally there were 4, but at the last minute they decided 4 wasn't enough. So they added Utah Beach, which delayed everything and made it more complicated. They had to gamble between coming up with the perfect plan and the perfect conditions and perfect weather, and gamble that or weigh that against the risk that the longer they waited, the more there would be some sort of security leak and the Germans wouldn't know exactly what they're doing. And at that point, it's much easier to defend against an attack. And it was actually Field Marshal Rommel, the German guy, who coined the phrase the longest day, because he was determined that the battle will be won on the beaches. And if the Allies can get ashore, they wouldn't be able to stop them long term. They could certainly inflict damage and make it difficult, but he felt that on whatever the day of the attack is, that will be the longest day.
Yeah, we got to get it done that day.
And he was right.
Okay, so we don't have a lot of time left, but I wanted, you mentioned that your favorite thing that you did on this trip, and of course you've had so many trips to France, you've seen a lot of stuff, but on this trip, you really liked the Marmottan Museum. And I'd like to hear why.
Well, I like, and maybe it's my aversion to crowd, but in general, I like small museums. You simply can't go to the Louvre and see everything in the Louvre in even a couple days. It's impressive and I love it, but the Marmottan it's a museum with the biggest collection of Monet paintings, number one, of anywhere in the world. I believe it was established through Monet's nephew or something like that, who had this collection or inherited this collection and created or donated the museum, I think, to the city. But it's not just Monet. There's a lot of other impressionism there. There's Manet, there's Beresseau, Renoir. Great impressionist museum that I actually prefer to larger museums like the d'Orsay. It's a little more obscure as far as where it is, getting there. It's way over by the 16th arrondissement. But it's not where most tourists stay. It's kind of a quiet, genteel Parisian neighborhood. But it's totally worth the effort, particularly if you're a fan of Monet or Impressionism, and particularly if you're then planning on going to Giverny or even the Orangerie Museum. If that's the sort of thing you gravitate towards, this museum is wonderful. And it's small enough that you can go there in a couple hours, see most of the collection, have the rest of your day.
And then you like the wine museum near the Eiffel Tower. That's interesting.
Well, it's funny because I first learned about this from you. You did a podcast with a friend of yours who ended up there. And I had it on my maps. I thought, okay, that's a possibility. But I knew I would leave the Marmottan and go through the Passé area. I wanted to go to the cemetery, the Passé Cemetery.
Yeah.
So I was walking down the road, saw this interesting staircase that led between buildings, walked down and realized, oh, the wine museum's right there. So I'm here. I didn't even try to get here, but I'm here.
You found
and it's
it.
not the place you would normally stumble upon. So I thought this must be a sign. I did go into it. And I didn't eat there, but I did visit the museum. And I think that includes a glass of wine afterwards in the wine cave. And I just had lunch. So it was nice to sit in this old wine cave and have a glass of wine.
We did this episode a long time ago with my friend Brenda, but I haven't been myself yet. And I've spent a lot of time around the Eiffel Tower, but always doing other things. There's so much to do around the Eiffel Tower. It's crazy.
There is. And again, if you like small museums, this is perfect. It's, it's small, it's focused. It's not going to the Metropolitan Museum of Art or something like that.
No. These are the smaller ones. Okay, and the last thing I wanted to mention is the Marquis de Lafayette, his grave at the Picpus Cemetery. It's not the same area, but it's around Paris. That's a small little private museum, isn't it?
I had one little theme of this trip, which was just not the main reason for the trip, but I wanted to visit all these monuments to Americans in Paris. And there are many. And so I saw George Washington and Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and all that. But the Marquis de Lafayette is really an honorary American. I mean, he came over during our Revolutionary War as a 19-year-old kid and funded himself and joined the battle. And he was a huge admirer of George Washington. In fact, he named his son George Washington Lafayette. He's buried in the Picpus Cemetery, which is a little hard to get to, and it's not always open. I think it's only open like 2 to 5 or something.
Yeah, I think I said earlier, it's a private museum. It's not a museum. It's a private cemetery.
Yeah, it's a private cemetery.
It's not a city of Paris cemetery. It's a privately owned cemetery.
Yeah, and they have a little chapel there. And they also, unfortunately, at this chapel, at this cemetery, they have the mass graves of a lot of the people executed during the, so I call it delicately, the troubles in Paris during the revolution. So there were just so many people killed, including many of Lafayette's family members who they suspect are probably buried there as well. Now, he was able to skillfully negotiate his way out of losing his head and died and was buried there. And if you go there, there's an American flag over his grave. And the legend has it that it was, I forget, the American military officer from World War I who came back and visited his grave and said, "Lafayette, we are here," or "we have returned," or something like that. So there's a large grave with an American flag over it. I just wanted to pay my respects. Lafayette and the French basically bailed out the U.S.'s butt in our Revolutionary War. And that's sometimes forgotten in this country, but...
Well, and the biggest problem with doing that is that it weakened the French king so much, Louis XVI, that he was then weak in front of the revolutionaries.
Yeah, he probably wouldn't have supported colonists being subservient to their monarch if he thought they'd be successful. And some theorize that he just wanted to weaken the British. He didn't want us to actually succeed because that could set a precedent for their colonies.
Yeah, that's totally possible. But it put him in a very weak position, and it didn't help him when the revolution started. But that's another program altogether.
Absolutely. But that kind of wrapped up. That was the end of my trip, and it was nice to pay a little homage to him and see a part of Paris I had never seen. That was great.
It's lovely to hear about France from your perspective because you've come so many times and you really have a really nice bird's eye view on these things, which a lot of visitors who just come for the first time don't have. So I hope everybody's taking good notes from your experiences.
I think the advantage of coming a lot of times is you don't have to check off all these big things on your list like the Louvre and the Arc de Triomphe and stuff. You've seen them and maybe you can go back, but there's all these other things that, whatever interests you, the smaller museums or the grave of Lafayette, whatever it is, there's so much more to see that if it's not your one and only trip to Paris, it really opens up your opportunities.
Well, and that's what the podcast is all about, is helping people who are coming for the first time have a really good experience and learn a lot. But also, if they want to stick around, there's a lot of depth to this as well. There are so many things you can do in Paris. And I'm always amused when people like, "Oh, but isn't that too many days in Paris? Am I going to run out of stuff to do?" I'm like, you have no idea.
And the problem with the success of your podcast is you point out all these things. So then, of course, you do a very good job of pointing out other things to do, which is great and definitely encourages people to take a longer vacation than they were planning.
I do what I can. Thank you very much, Phil. It's been lovely talking to you. And I'm sure you'll be back to talk about some other experiences one of these days. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Annie. Au revoir.
Again, I want to thank my patrons for giving back and supporting the show. Welcome to new patron supporters, Angela Forwood, Ellen Cole, Tara Crampton, Laura Poffenberger, Jen Hanneman, Lee Mayer, Jim Kujarzik, Gina Logan, and Donna Deaver. I would love for you to become a patron because it's mutually beneficial. By doing that, you get access to exclusive content, and your patronage makes it possible for me to consistently deliver engaging and insightful French-focused content. You too can keep this podcast alive and thriving. A little bit of feedback on the France bootcamp. Well, it went better than I had hoped. The participants were fantastic. It was a delight to meet all of them, and I'm sure we'll stay in touch because they were so cool. And by the end of the week, I knew all their names. It took me all week. Oh, I'm so bad with names, but I do like people, and I could immediately recognize all their faces and could tell in the crowd if this one was with me or not. So anyway, we had a great time. There were no mishaps. Nobody got hurt. Nobody got robbed. There were a couple of people who unfortunately came down with COVID while the boot camp was on. Headaches, nausea, feeling unwell, but nothing too bad. Overall, it was really, really good. I learned some lessons, and you'll hear about those next week. I will do this again, but I'm not ready to announce details yet. But several people have already emailed me saying they're interested. So if you are interested, the only way to let me know, please don't tell me on Facebook or whatever, because there are so many people. I can't keep track of them. So the only way to let me know that you're interested is to email me, Annie@joinusinfrance.com, or if that doesn't go through, try annie.sargent@gmail.com. That's the one that works all the time. And I will put you on the list. Earlier, I played some feedback from Anne, who did an itinerary consult with me. If you're interested in purchasing this service for your own trip, visit joinusinfrance.com/boutique. Read the description carefully, and it will tell you everything you need to know. But since you're still with me at the end of this episode, let me explain this. There are two ways to get my voice map tours, either through the voice map app or through my website, the joinusinfrance.com boutique. There are pros and cons of both. The pros of going through the voice map app is that you can read all the reviews, you see the path the tour takes, you read the tips that I shared, you get the download immediately because it's an in-app purchase. It's immediate. If you buy from my website, you get a big discount. And the more tours you buy at once, the more you save. But you don't necessarily see the reviews. I don't post the reviews on my website. So if you want to get the discount and read the reviews, this is what you do. First, you go to joinusinfrance.com/Annie Tours. And that will redirect you to the voice map page. Well, that's my own voice map page with all the info, the reviews, the map, all of that. And then you go back to joinusinfrance.com/boutique, and you go to the tours page, and you buy from my boutique because that's where you get the discount. All right, I better get out of here. I made some spectacular mistakes the last few days. I mean, thankfully, it's just a podcast. Nobody dies if I make a mistake. But, what happens is the stress of the boot camp, lack of sleep, it all adds up. And yeah, there were some interesting things. But life is getting back to normal. I'll get an early night tonight, and there's a storm going through the Toulouse area, and there's nothing better for sleep, as far as I'm concerned, as rumbling thunder. Thank you so much, podcast editor Christian Codovan. Thank you so much for listening. Join me again next week so you can hear our special episode about the first France bootcamp, and so we can look around France together. Au revoir. The Join Us in France Travel Podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2023 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.